Hello everyone, I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's streaming-only History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're working safely with a skeleton crew from our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Tune in next week when we'll feature Larry Wells discussing his new book, In Faulkner's Shadow. Larry married Faulkner's niece, Dean, and together they co-founded the Yoknapatawpha Press. So we're looking forward to that. We scheduled today's History is Lunch program in conjunction with our special exhibit, Mississippi Distilled, which looks at prohibition in Mississippi, commonly known as the wettest dry state. Before I introduce our speaker today, though, I want to invite you all to join us tomorrow for another streaming program related to Mississippi Distilled. Sounds of Prohibition is a virtual exploration of the music performed during that era on the Gold Coast and around the state. Blues historian Scott Beretta will talk with musicians Jesse Robinson, Nellie Mack, Willie Silas, and Cheryl Holly. The program is made possible by a grant from the Mississippi Humanities Council. So you'll find that on the Museum of Mississippi History's Facebook page. Today, we are delighted to welcome back our old friend Tom Henderson to discuss Mississippi's black market liquor tax. Pearl native Tom Henderson holds a BA in history from the University of Southern Mississippi and an MLS from Florida State University. Before retiring as director of the Millsaps College Library, he worked as an archivist at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, as architecture librarian at Mississippi State University, and as patent, trademark, and government documents librarian at the Mississippi Library Commission. Welcome, Tom Henderson.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for being here and for tuning in today. Mississippi's long and sometimes difficult history with alcohol is presented very clearly in the Mississippi Distilled exhibit upstairs. I hope you'll take time to go visit that. The artifacts, to me, bring out stories and rumors that are familiar to me and probably to many of you if you grew up in Mississippi. But no aspect of our Prohibition history was more controversial, more despised, or more profitable to the state than the black market tax of 1944. Constantly under threat of repeal by the legislature and often criticized by wets and dries alike, it survived largely intact for 20 years and produced over $20 million of much-needed tax revenue. According to some, though, it was a tax on sin. My talk today is about the tax and its implementation in the context of the state's political and fiscal environment. A quick disclaimer, though, I'm not a legal scholar or a social sciences scholar. This talk is a prequel, if you will, to Josh Green's excellent discussion of the Jackson Country Club raid of 1966. If you missed Josh's presentation on August 19th, it's on the department's YouTube channel. The 1944 law imposing the tax never mentions liquor, but it was clear to legislators and the public that its purpose was to tax and hopefully diminish the significant liquor business in Mississippi. The enforcement of the law was given to the state tax collector, an elected executive office with limited responsibilities to collect certain taxes and deal with certain tax delinquencies. It also seemed to be rather redundant. The State Tax Commission, created in 1960, already collected most taxes, including the retail sales tax. In the decades before 1944, Mississippi had moved from a local option liquor law, similar to what we have now, to statewide bone-dry prohibition. Overlaying that period was our national experience with prohibition. Prohibitionist supporters of the 1886 local option law expected few counties would actually vote for liquor, and they were right. Liquor was such a political hot potato, then as it is now, or was, that few politicians wanted to support it. And so by 1908, only 8 of the 78 counties had voted in favor of liquor. As you might expect, the wet counties were along the Mississippi River and the Gulf Coast, perennially wet spots regardless of what law was in effect. Amid growing prohibitionist sentiment nationally and in Mississippi, the 1908 Prohibition Law went into effect in 1909, and we began a 58-year period of official prohibition. But as most in Mississippi already knew, in Mississippi, prohibition prohibits nothing. Efforts to tax and penalize liquor violations included a 1910 law under which any person selling liquor would be liable for multiple fines of $500 to the state, the county, and the town if it was in a town. The tax collector was specifically authorized to pursue such action in Chancery Court. The tax collector in the 1930s, J.B. Gulley, utilized this law called to abate common nuisances against bootleggers hundreds of times in his reign, in his administration before the black market tax. Mississippi's general retail sales tax, implemented in 1932, also applied to illegal liquor sales, although, as you might expect, it was very difficult to collect. After the 21st Amendment ended national prohibition in 1933, money began to pour into federal coffers from the $2 per gallon federal tax on liquor and from the sale of federal liquor stamps. In 1934, over 600 such stamps were sold in dry Mississippi. In that same year, a statewide referendum, Mississippi voters overwhelmingly to remain dry. This is the federal retail liquor dealer special tax stamp that was issued to anyone who paid $27.50 in the 1930s. This one happens to be from Montana. I've never seen one from Mississippi. I wish I could find one. But possession of this stamp and a receipt for paying black market taxes would very often absolve a bootlegger of his sins. The legislature didn't fail to notice the amount of liquor being sold in Mississippi and the fact that the state got little revenue from it. In 1938, a bill was introduced to establish state-owned liquor stores, impose a liquor tax, and allow local option. This effort failed to pass, as would dozens more, while the legislature and the public grappled with whether to tax the stuff, to legalize it, or try to enforce the unenforceable. By 1942, the state budget was in trouble, but new taxes remained controversial. The federal income tax had gone up, and Mississippi's own income tax was already far out of line with other states. The editor of the Hattiesburg American reminded the governor of an untouched source of revenue, whiskey. It was available everywhere, and Mississippi should benefit from taxing it. Actually, the state was awash in alcohol, from DeSoto County to Harrison County and most of the counties in between. The 1944 session of the legislature considered a few liquor-related bills, but no serious effort to legalize it was expected. Bills to change absentee voting for servicemen and to allow women to serve on juries were in the hopper, but liquor was not discussed much until late March. On March 27th, Representatives J.T. Brown of Hinds County and Hilton Waits of Leland introduced House Bill 892, an act to discourage black markets. The bill went to the House Ways and Means Committee and quickly passed the House the next day, 119 to 17. Waits apparently surprised many members of the House when he disclosed that the Tax Commission was already collecting a 2% sales tax on all the bootleggers it can reach, and this merely raised the tax to 12%. In the Senate, there was little debate, but one important amendment was added. The Tax Commission wanted the tangible property clause modified by adding articles or commodities, because in Mississippi at the time, whiskey was not recognized as property. The Senate passed the bill 29 to 14, and Governor Bailey signed it on April 1st. Yes, April 1st. Bailey said it was the beginning of a crusade against black marketing and bootlegging, which should result in ridding our state of a curse. The law itself is spelled out in 9 brief sections, all of which are printed on 2 pages of the laws of 1944. Section 1 specifies the 10% tax on the sale of anything which is prohibited by law. Section 2 vests the responsibility for collecting the tax with a state tax collector, and he's authorized to enforce the law in any court in the state. Section 3 empowers the collector to prescribe the method and procedure governing the collection of the tax. Section 7 deals with the controversial 10% commission. Taxes collected under the Act were to be paid into the state treasury, but the collector was allowed to retain 10% of that amount to pay expenses incident to the enforcement of the Act including his compensation and that of deputies and attorneys. And here's the key part. The 10% commission shall be in addition to other fees and commissions allowed by law. Until the black market law was passed, the tax collector collected mostly delinquent ad valorem and privilege taxes and some liquor penalties. For those taxes, the tax collector received a 20% commission, but was limited to a maximum of $5,000 for his salary. In most of the years from 1944 to 1964, the total of those ad valorem and miscellaneous taxes averaged about $35,000 a year. So you can see 20% of that was not a lot of money. The new law, however, put no cap on the amount the tax collector or his deputies could receive from the 10% black market tax receipts, a provision that would bring endless criticism. And that criticism was immediate and harsh, much of it coming from the Clarion Ledger. Under Mississippi's queer, illogical, and hypocritical law, not a single saloon has closed, they said. The tax is a pitiful reward for the state's complicity in the licensing of law violators, and far short of the millions of dollars advocates had claimed. Judge Sebe Dale, who later on tried to indict William Winter, called it the most damnable disgrace and rankest hypocrisy ever perpetrated by a lawmaking body. Bill Miner was no fan of it either. Writing in a series of articles on Mississippi's perplexing liquor laws, he said, despite bone-dry provisions of the law, Mississippians by the thousands ignore it. A sort of extra-legal local option with apparent sanction from the state had come into being. Usually preceded with adjectives like infamous and so-called, the black market tax remained the subject of widespread criticism. Suits against bootleggers occurred rather often. The vast majority of them usually settled with the payment of a small fine. The first case involving the black market tax was tried in Yazoo County in 1945, but was actually based on the 1910 statute, which was being used by the tax collector to force payment of the black market tax. The tax collector used this tactic rather than the black market tax law itself, probably because it had been used so effectively and easily in Chancery Court. The state Supreme Court ruled in 1950 that the 1910 law could in fact be used this way, and it was used many times and most often by the tax collectors. A case involving a large liquor wholesaler turned on an unexpected issue. The tax collector, Mrs. Bailey at the time, sued the Muse brothers of Rankin County for $141,000 in penalties under the 1910 statute for multiple liquor sales in 3 counties. The judge ruled that such penalties were not meant to be cumulative. The $500 applied to every sale, and that's how she arrived at the $141,000. He said it was not cumulative, but could be charged for only one violation per suit, and so he reduced the amount to $4,000. In effect, Bailey won the case, but she didn't get the amount. Bailey appealed to the state Supreme Court for the full amount, but the Supreme Court pretty much ignored the appeal for the extra money and instead ruled for the Muses because they had incriminated themselves in the trial testimony. A case from Pelahatchie seems to have been the first time defendants actually used compliance with the law as a defense. The defendant's attorney said the Gibsons, who owners of the Tiptoe Inn near Pelahatchie, had fully complied with federal and state laws by paying all their black market taxes and sales taxes, and they had a valid federal liquor stamp. But they were quickly found not guilty by the jury. Sheriffs frequently complained about juries not convicting liquor law violation, but juries were reluctant to convict people who appeared to comply with a confusing set of laws. Sheriffs were about the only law enforcers on the front lines of liquor enforcement. And although a few sheriffs successfully kept their counties dry, most wavered on the issue, depending on the politics and the general sentiment of their constituents. The counties in Mississippi were a patchwork of de facto local option. In 1944, the Federal Office of Price Administration cracked down on black markets, particularly in gasoline and liquor. It seems that Mississippi bootleggers were charging way more than the OPA restrictions allowed. A Jasper County bootlegger, for instance, was accused of $50,000 in overcharges for liquor. He had been selling bourbon for $100 a case that had a legal ceiling price of only $38. The Clearing Ledger said the OPA's campaign against bootleggers may prove far more effective than the black market tax in putting them out of business. State tax collector Carl Craig had just begun his second term in 1944. Formerly a wholesale grocer in New Albany, Mississippi, he had served as state auditor from 1936 to 1940, but he was unable to succeed himself. Interestingly, shortly before the elections in 1943, Craig asked the legislature to consider putting the tax collector's office on a straight salary basis with a legislative appropriation to support the office instead of commissions. Craig and his deputies were already on salary and did not receive any commission-based income. In his first term as tax collector, Craig seldom appeared in the press, but he had his work cut out for him with the black market tax. The Internal Revenue Service reported about 1,200 dealers had federal stamps, including about 55 wholesale operators. Craig immediately left for a 4-day inspection tour, talking to dealers to determine the prospects for actually collecting the tax. He found most dealers were willing to pay without much protest, but he did warn them that it was going to be enforced. Bootleggers quickly realized that it was to their advantage to pay up. Craig was working out the details of the procedure along with his chief attorney, Forrest Jackson. He designed a simple form with space for the name and address of the bootlegger and columns for the gross sales, the 10% tax, and the total that was due. This form was actually used during Ms. Bailey's term, but it's similar to the one Craig designed. It's simple and to the point, and I think was pretty much self-reported from what I can tell. This particular one is from a lady on the Gulf Coast, and you see she reported, I think, $2,000 worth of sales. She computed the tax and presumably sent a check for that amount. In the first month, about $30,000 was collected, although Craig said the tax collector's office didn't want the job of collecting the black market tax. As each month passed, they were finding more and more records of whiskey sales and predicted they would eventually get all of the sellers. Craig quickly figured out that he couldn't collect the 10% tax without knowing how much liquor was sold. He knew who most of the bootleggers were because the federal liquor stamp information he had. He also knew that most of the liquor flowing into Mississippi came from Louisiana and from Illinois at that time. In fact, on exports to Mississippi, Louisiana charged only 30 cents per case for an inspection fee and no taxes, making Louisiana liquor much less expensive than that from other states. Craig reached an agreement with the Louisiana Revenue Department and most of our neighboring states, except Tennessee, to provide copies of liquor sales invoices on shipments to Mississippi. With that information in hand, his deputies could collect the tax from the sellers that they could find. The state quickly became dependent on black market tax revenue. Steadily increasing amounts made it more difficult to seriously consider repeal, and certain events made the legislature quite aware of the importance of the tax. For instance, after a widely publicized shooting on the Rankin County Gold Coast in 1946, many of the clubs there closed down. Although it turned out to be a very temporary closure, Craig warned that Rankin County liquor sellers alone paid about $10,000 a month in black market taxes, one of the highest paying counties. And at that rate, the loss of $120,000 a year would be a significant hit on the state budget. And also, frequently, the newspapers published the names of all the people who bought federal liquor stamps. One problem that faced Craig was the number of untaxed shipments from Illinois and Louisiana sent to non-existent persons or businesses and to persons with no federal stamp. To solve this, he got shipment records from all of the regional federal alcohol and tax unit districts to aid him in identifying the fraudulent shipments. Craig's successor, Mrs. Bailey, would also use this data to practically eliminate the problem. A special session called by Governor Wright in late 1947 was expected to repeal the tax. Wright argued correctly that it had failed to discourage the sale of illegal commodities. The Senate approved the measure, but heated debate featuring clergymen and bootleggers on the same side led the House to vote it down. Representative Zelma Price of Greenville scolded the House in a fiery speech saying, "Let's quit putting our heads in the sand and saying we are a dry state. There's no such thing. Prohibition laws are a complete failure, making criminals out of ordinary people." Carl Craig decided not to seek re-election in 1947, perhaps weary of enforcing the black market tax. But instead, he successfully ran for state auditor again. In almost 4 years, Craig collected over $2 million, a substantial infusion of cash, but still far short of the dollars expected by the legislature. Nella Massey Bailey succeeded Carl Craig as state tax collector in 1948. Publicly known as Mrs. Thomas L. Bailey, she was the widow of the governor who signed the black market tax law. Governor Bailey had died in office in 1946. Mrs. Bailey was also the first woman elected to a statewide office in Mississippi, and this former librarian would be elected 2 more times to the post. As the wife of a governor and state representative, she was familiar with state government and politics and was well known as the First Lady and for her work in civic organizations. I chose this quote because I thought it was funny. It's from a letter she wrote in response to a request from someone who simply wanted a list of all the taverns in Mississippi. And I can only imagine the smile that might have been on her face and her tongue in her cheek when she said, "We have no taverns." With no incumbent on the ticket in 1947, the field was wide open. Bailey used her position as widow of the governor in campaign publicity, certainly gaining some sympathy, but clearly capitalizing on the popularity of her late husband. Also, at this time, the job wasn't perceived to be quite as lucrative as it would become later on, and the race drew only 2 opponents. One of those opponents withdrew before the first primary, saying it was time Mississippi elected a woman. The remaining opponent, a former sheriff then working in the state auditor's office, at least on paper, was probably more qualified than Bailey, but she easily won the election in the first primary. Bailey retained most of Craig's squad of deputies and continued his practice of using federal liquor stamp records and Louisiana sales records to identify liquor sellers, but she admitted things did not get straightened out for a while. But in 1948, she collected $785,000 in black market taxes, a record to that time. She credited better cooperation with law enforcement and with wholesalers in other states, and the elimination of almost all of the falsified liquor invoices, the problem that had plagued Craig. Newspapers frequently ran reports of tax collections, like this one detailing the biennial taxes 1949 to 1951. I frequently found monthly and annual reports also, almost always calling attention to the 10% commission the tax collector got. Further refining the collection process, Bailey began focusing on wholesalers. She said tracking down every retailer, some of them way out in the woods, was way too much trouble, so she told the wholesalers to collect the tax when the retailer picked up the order. And this plan worked very well. Bailey divided the state into 9 districts, and each one had a deputy to collect the tax. Bill Miner observed that with an ample amount of money, she can afford to pay, and pay well, for information to keep the leggers in line. Bailey easily won re-election in 1951 in the first primary against 2 opponents. Robert W. May, who was a state treasurer, came in second. He had campaigned with the slogan, "A man for a man's job." In early 1954, Yazoo County Representative Harry Applebaum introduced a bill to allow the 15 counties which had voted for local option in the 1952 referendum to let them have liquor. This measure failed, of course. Applebaum, however, had done his homework and in request to Bailey, asked her to defend the method of taxing liquor by the case, another policy she had implemented. Her response revealed a lot about the operation of the office. Prior to her administration, the deputy tax collectors were paid a salary plus expenses, and in 1947 had collected almost $500,000 in black market taxes. Bailey put her deputies on a 4% commission. They paid their own expenses, and in 1948, she collected almost double that amount, $955,000. In addition, she changed the tax from a straight 10% of sales, which was often impossible to calculate accurately, to a flat rate per case, for instance, $3 on a case of fifths. And she collected on every sale by wholesalers. Applebaum noticed that a flat rate resulted in far less than 10%, but Bailey explained that while that was true, since the beginning of the tax, it had been necessary to approximate the value and the tax. And besides, the law allowed the tax collector to prescribe the method and procedure for collecting the tax. She said, "I feel that the increase in the amount I have collected commends the method I used." By 1956, liquor prices were going up everywhere, so Bailey revised the tax rate again to bring it closer to the 10% required. In a memo to wholesale liquor dealers on January 25th, she said, "After studying your sales invoices for several months, I find $3 a case on whiskey does not equal the amount, and informed them that the new rate would be $4.20 a case." The previous year, the state had raised the special sales tax on liquor sales to 5%, resulting then in roughly a 15% tax total. Although Louisiana, where most of the liquor originated, had supplied wholesale records for years, Bailey found it more efficient to hire 3 part-time secretaries to work in the Louisiana Revenue Office. They would make copies of all the invoices and add additional information like the number of cases, who the driver was, the tag number, all sorts of details that she could use to track them down. Working on their own time, these part-time secretaries were paid directly by the tax collector. One of the most publicized court cases in Bailey's administration began in 1944 when she filed suit against Kenneth and Lauren Muse, Jesse Jabez Hinton, and 6 others, demanding the $141,000 in penalties for liquor sales in Rankin, Hinds, and Madison counties. I mentioned this case earlier, but the trial testimony revealed some interesting details about their liquor business. In the trial, the Muse brothers admitted selling $500,000 of liquor in 1953, sometimes filling over 100 orders a month, and they said they paid at least some of their black market taxes. Jesse Hinton described the method of taking telephone orders in Rankin County, picking up the orders in Louisiana, and then delivering them to the customer's door. This was done to avoid a physical presence in Rankin County, where the sheriff at the time, L.G. Holyfield, was especially tough on liquor sellers. Later, under a more tolerant sheriff, the Muses built a warehouse and did their business on the Gold Coast. While the Muse case was being resolved, Representative Ralph Herron of Covington County introduced a tax repeal bill much different from previous attempts. His bill would repeal the tax at the end of Bailey's present term or her successor if any vacancy should occur, and that no election would be held in 1959, thereby abolishing the office. The bill did not pass, but it proved to be rather prophetic. Nella Bailey died on March 31st, 1956. Her death on a Saturday left a vacuum of unusual proportions in state government, and by Monday morning, Governor Coleman was besieged by applicants for what was then described as the choicest political plum in the state. Coleman was expected to name a successor quickly. Several names were mentioned in the press. But some speculated that Coleman, an opponent of the tax, might consider leaving the post vacant, thereby repealing the black market tax by default. Governor Coleman instead chose to appoint William Winter, a young representative from Grenada who had served in the legislature since 1948 and who was a teetotaler. Coleman felt he owed Winter the appointment for failing to support him in a run for Speaker of the House against Walter Sillars. Winter personally disliked the black market tax and thought the office of state tax collector should be abolished. He had worked toward that end as a legislator, and in 1948 had voted for a local option bill. Winter wrote later, "The hypocrisy of the situation distressed me. It was corrupting a number of sheriffs and making it impossible for the law to be enforced with uniformity and consistency." Winter inherited a good staff of deputies and a well-organized, efficient operation, but he immediately set about making it even more efficient. Describing the job in 1957, he said the tax collector primarily handles some of the odds and ends of the revenue collecting chores, the most intriguing of which is undoubtedly the black market tax. Not every sale of liquor can be taxed, but the process is highly efficient. His staff included a chief deputy in charge of detailed operations and accounting, 5 full-time deputies who collected the tax, an attorney, an accountant, and a stenographer. Although the office collected delinquent ad valorem and privilege taxes and liquor penalties, he said 90% of their time was spent dealing with the black market tax. Winter himself actually went out and collected some of the taxes from the wholesalers. When Winter assumed the office, he continued Bailey's practice of collecting the tax from wholesalers instead of retailers. But he recognized that the state was unable to collect the tax on about 25% of the liquor. Not only was there lost revenue to the state, but a morale issue arose among the wholesalers who were trying to obey the law, or at least one of the laws, he said. In April 1956, Winter asked Governor Coleman to intervene for him with Governor Long of Louisiana. He wanted Louisiana wholesalers to restrict the export of tax-discounted liquor to only those Mississippi wholesalers who were in good standing for tax purposes with the tax commission and the tax collector. If Louisiana agreed, he said, the tax evasion problem would be eliminated. Governor Long agreed with the proposal and referred the matter to Winter's counterpart in Baton Rouge, I.D. Meredith. In late summer 1956, Winter called a meeting of the entire membership of the tax-paying bootlegging fraternity in Mississippi. It was, he said, a scene right out of Guys and Dolls. They appeared for the most part to be typical hard-working businessmen, such as would gather for a committee meeting at the Chamber of Commerce. And as a matter of fact, some of them were active in their local chambers. They were eager to cooperate. I don't know if this is the scene from Guys and Dolls Winter was thinking about, but they might look like bootleggers anyway. In September, Winter sent Meredith the list of approved sellers who had qualified for a Mississippi tax stamp, meaning the holder had a federal liquor stamp and had agreed to pay all the taxes due the state and to keep accurate invoice records. He also sent the list to the Louisiana wholesalers. Subsequently, the number of delinquent liquor taxpayers was reduced to virtually zero. Winter quipped that he had, in effect, become the licensing agent for the illegal liquor business in Mississippi. A visit to one of the biggest liquor wholesalers was described by Winter in his memoirs. The large metal warehouse on Casey's Lane housed the Muse Brothers wholesale liquor operation. They were the largest black market taxpayer at the time, paying about $12,000 a month in crisp $1,000 bills. The warehouse, busy with deliveries, was stacked high with $100,000 of wine and whiskey. Winter said he had some degree of respect for the Muses, who supplied liquor to a large number of distinguished clientele in Jackson. He recognized their resourcefulness and the uncertainty of being at the mercy of everyone from the governor to the sheriff. However, when an entire load of their liquor was confiscated and the Muses asked for credit on the taxes they had already paid, Winter was sympathetic but told them that was simply a hazard of doing business. He continued to support the elimination of his position. He explained the tax collector used to have significant duties when ad valorem taxes were the principal sources of income. But as the state progressed from a property tax base to one based on sales, income, and excise taxes, the tax commission had assumed most of the duties and was then collecting 90% of all the taxes. The tax collector was left with the odds and ends like the black market tax. He added, "We often bump into a collector from the tax commission when we're out collecting the liquor tax." It would save the state money if one agency was responsible for collecting all the taxes, and the public might be less confused, too. When Circuit Judge Sebe Dale tried to indict Winter for conspiring with the bootleggers to violate prohibition laws, Winter made a surprise appearance in his court. Over the objections of the judge, the grand jury asked Winter to explain himself. Well, for that, they got a 20-minute lesson on how the black market tax worked and how the state had more money for schools and hospitals thanks to the tax. And by the way, he added, instead of indicting me, I hope all of you will vote for me. The tax collector was required to report the operations of the office to the legislature every 2 years. At that time, the legislature met biennially. Most of the reports during the period of the black market tax are very short documents like this one. The upper portion shows the amount collected in various categories of delinquent, ad valorem, and privilege taxes. Some years, the reports also included the liquor penalties. The summary section there in the middle shows the disbursements to the tax collector, his deputy, and attorneys. But you have to look very carefully to find the black market tax, highlighted at the bottom of the page. Identified simply as receipts under Section 1010801 Code of 1942 are the black market tax receipts, some $2.6 million in this case. Also shown is the 10% deduction for administrative purposes and the balance paid to the treasurer. There's no detail in their semi-annual or their biannual report about how the 10% was spent. But it certainly includes commissions to the deputies, attorney's fees, clerical help, office supplies, and of course the tax collector's portion. As you know, William Winter came under great fire for his salary from the black market tax. Controversy over the tax in 1958 took an unusual turn when Mrs. R.L. Eazell, past president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, publicly conceded that a local option liquor law was best for the state. In a public forum, she agreed with Senator George Owens, whose special Senate study committee had recommended repeal of the black market tax, a bone-dry statewide prohibition law, and local option for counties. Legislative budget leaders, however, feared a big loss of revenue under local option, noting that only 15 counties voted for it in 1952, and those same counties would not produce enough liquor tax to replace the current taxes. Black market taxes in 1957 set a record high of $1.2 million, up considerably over the previous year. In addition, the legislature considered making the state tax commission the collector of liquor taxes, but the commission director at that time wanted nothing to do with the whiskey tax. The bill that resulted from the Senate subcommittee committee report eventually joined others on the growing stack of rejected liquor reform bills. William Winter decided in 1959 to run for a full term as state tax collector. Because of the publicity surrounding him and the black market tax and the attractive income from the post, the race drew a field of 9 opponents, none of whom were well known, but all of whom wanted the high salary. William E. Andrews had been Bailey's chief deputy tax collector. Lee Prysock's main qualification was being a strong segregationist. And Charles Mosby's only qualification, apparently, was being an experienced taxpayer. Winter won a large plurality in the first primary and defeated John Birdsong by 54,000 votes in the second primary. Winter's second term was marked by continued attacks on the black market tax, perhaps the most well-known being the Life magazine article published in May of 1962. Winter is named and identified as the second highest paid public official in the country, second only to the president. The article goes on to describe the strange liquor situation in dry Mississippi, where you can buy whiskey almost everywhere easily. At the time, there were 946 federal retail liquor dealers and 24 wholesalers in the state. Also, in the spring of 1962, when the legislature was considering another local option bill, the Huntley-Brinkley report on the NBC Evening News ran a short expose of Mississippi liquor. Reporter Jack Perkins is shown making the rounds of bootleggers on the Rankin County Gold Coast after getting explicit directions to them at the airport. You can watch this film in the Mississippi Distilled exhibit upstairs. Other events were keeping the liquor situation in the news. In a case similar to the famous Jackson Country Club raid, illegal liquor was found in the Laurel Country Club. And a group of Jackson restaurant owners, angered that some restaurants were selling liquor, asked the governor to either enforce the liquor law or to end prohibition. And sheriffs were finding it difficult to make a case against liquor violations, as in Lauderdale County, where at least 6 cases have been dismissed in the first 2 months of the new sheriff's term. The legislative session of 1962 saw renewed support for change despite killing a local option bill. Bills in the Senate and the House proposed to transfer the duties of the tax collector, including a black market tax, to the tax commission, and abolish the office of tax collector at the end of Winter's term in December 1963, a measure he had supported for many years and endorsed. The Senate passed the final version of the bill on May 14th. The tax commission, under a new director at the time, was more amenable to the task than ever before. The black market tax, however, remained on the books for the time being. William Winter, his job about to end, ran successfully for state treasurer in 1963, and of course he went on to become governor. He remains a widely respected elder statesman of Mississippi, but is also remembered for his efficient operation of the office of tax collector and for his foresight and courage to endorse abolishing the office he held. He collected over $10 million in his term. The last black market taxes were collected in the first half of 1964 by the Tax Commission. A liquor tax division had been set up with the same procedures that were used by the tax collector. In the legislative session of 1964, a statewide referendum bill passed both houses but was vetoed by Governor Johnson. But 2 other bills were passed, further affecting the liquor tax. One bill essentially repealed the 1944 Act and replaced it with a 6% wholesale tax and a 9% retail tax. Another bill, the Wholesale Compensating Act, put a 10% tax on liquor imported into the state. Both bills went into effect July 1, 1964, thereby ending the infamous black market tax. These new taxes, however, were still a tax on a product that was prohibited by law. In the 2 fiscal years the Tax Commission collected these taxes, 1964 to 1966, almost $4 million in liquor sales and excise taxes were received. Mississippi bootleggers faced an unusual problem in late 1964. The state of Louisiana decided to stop putting tax stamps on liquor bottles. Until that time, tax agents in Mississippi could easily determine that taxes had been paid, but without a stamp, they wouldn't know. The Tax Commission managed to buy 2 million old Louisiana tax stamps and told the sellers to put them on themselves. Presumably, the taxes on that liquor had been paid. This stamp, which you can also see upstairs in the exhibit, may be the one used. A story that may be true relates how Tax Commission employees helped liquor sellers apply the stamps in order to avoid having large quantities of unstamped liquor on hand during the upcoming busy Christmas season. The incident also played well with critics of Mississippi's liquor law, saying the stamp problem only adds to the confusion caused by the state's haphazard liquor regulations. In all, the black market tax yielded over $20 million to the state in its 20-year run. The 3 tax collectors who administered the law found ways to accomplish the spirit of the law, if not the letter, and in a practical and efficient manner. Despised by most and constantly under threat of repeal, it failed its primary mission to discourage black markets. It was difficult to defend and was seen as hypocritical at best. But state budget leaders, right or wrong, continued to vote against repeal because of the state's dependency on the revenue. Ironically, the state's highly efficient administration of taxes on illegal liquor was partly responsible for the real repeal of prohibition in 1966. Thank you. Do we have any questions, Chris?
We surely do. Let's see, one here. You had mentioned that the tax was aimed to diminish alcohol use in the state. The question was the loss of potential revenue considered at the time that the tax was originally passed?
I'm sure it was, because I think the perhaps unstated purpose of the law was to raise revenue.
Right.
And, it was sold as a means of curbing or diminishing it, but I think the legislators clearly were aware that it would raise, and in fact, there was probably more liquor afterwards than before. So.
One viewer asks, which areas of the state were wettest during Prohibition in Mississippi?
That's easy to answer. As I said a while ago, the river counties particularly, and the Gulf Coast. But there were pockets all over. The Gold Coast and Rankin County was certainly a hotbed. DeSoto County was wild with liquor and gambling because, sort of like Rankin County's proximity to Jackson, it had a customer base in Memphis. Meridian was pretty popular too among bootleggers, and I understand Jones County was as well. So it was pretty much all over. There were a few counties. I read somewhere that there were 5 counties where the sheriff really enforced the law, and they could be really described as dry. So that leaves, 77.
Question from the viewer. How was the 10% commission spending overseen by the state? Was the state auditor at all?
How was what?
The 10% that was collected, was that a public record that was overseen by the state at all, or was it?
As I pointed out on the tax collector's reports, it's not broken down at all. I referred a while ago to Representative Applebaum, who was investigating and questioning Ms. Bailey. He told her at one point that he had received from, I suppose, the state treasurer's office, essentially her pay stubs. So he knew how much she was actually drawing. The money had to be spent through the state's fiscal channels, but there was no public accounting of it unless you went to look for it. And that's what made it so controversial. I think in reality, William Winter didn't get as rich as people thought he did, but he had a nice income from it. So did Ms. Bailey. I think Carl Craig remained with the flat salary the time he was state tax collector. But no, to answer your question, there was very little accounting, but it was handled through the state's physical channels.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Speaking of making money, did the sheriffs get kickbacks and make a little more money than the sheriff?
They did. That's not something that's written down anywhere, but almost every source, at least comments on the likelihood of sheriffs getting paybacks. And, you have to think in 82 jurisdictions, some were doing that, and particularly, in ones where it was openly flaunted. Rankin County is probably a good example. But it varied from sheriff to sheriff. Like Holyfield was a terror. I mean, I can't imagine he would have taken anything. But, you don't have a county where you have that much liquor and gambling going on and have the sheriff looking over your shoulder all the time. So.
Sarah Kimball asks, do you know the origin of the name black market for non-legal sales?
That's a really good question. I don't have any idea what the origin is. I suspect, though, it refers to sort of clandestine or, undercover sales of products that shouldn't be sold.
Got a question. Why was the Louisiana liquor sale rate to Mississippi so much lower than other states?
Well, I don't have a real good answer for that, but I feel certain it was because there was such a huge market in Mississippi, and the wholesalers in Louisiana were so, so close to Mississippi buyers. In Tallulah, Louisiana, the little town about 20 miles west of Vicksburg, there were half a dozen big liquor wholesalers there. And the little town, there used to be a town called Delta, or Delta Point, right at the end of the bridge. Mike Morrissey, one of the biggest wholesalers in the country, had his headquarters over there. Vidalia and Faraday, Louisiana, and of course New Orleans and Baton Rouge, all those towns on that side of the border. For some reason, they recognized this market and were willing to subsidize it with almost no taxes.
Volume, volume, volume. We have a question. Did the funds collected or the money collected by the liquor tax go to the general fund in Mississippi, or was it earmarked for particular projects?
I think the 90% that went to the state treasury did go into the general fund. I don't recall seeing anything that was earmarked for anything special, although, typically it was defended as a funding source for schools or hospitals, whatever might be needed at the time.
We had a question about violence in Mississippi during the years of the black market liquor tax. Was there much violence a la Chicago or places like that?
I can't think of reading anywhere that we had anything like the scale of gang violence that you read about in Chicago, for instance. But there clearly was some violence. I think a lot of it, though, was not related so much to the liquor and gambling business as it was simply interactions between people who didn't like each other. There was an example, I didn't put it in the paper, but I think sometime in the 50s, I believe, where some bootleggers murdered the sheriff of Marion County. Of course, that didn't do anything to help their cause, but it was pretty serious charge. Other than that, I'm not aware of anything that would be anything close to organized gang violence. But there were plenty of murders and shootings.
And the same person asks, were liquor raids common?
Yeah, I think so. It depends on the sheriff who was in charge. And I guess the need to soothe sentiment in a town, for instance. At the time, I said a while ago, the sheriff was really the frontline law enforcement for liquor. In towns, it may be the police, but typically it was the sheriff. The State Highway Patrol at the time was almost exclusively traffic, and so they couldn't be called on. And so that's why the governor used the National Guard on a number of occasions. There were at least 12 or 14 National Guard forays just into the Gold Coast. And he used it in other places, the Gulf Coast particularly. DeSoto County, I think, got hit several times. So I'd say there were quite a number of them, but it's hard to judge the frequency. One sheriff in Rankin County, who's I can't think of right now, it could have been Holyfield. I remember reading an article there where he had in the first month of his term, he had raided some 40 places. So that's kind of extreme, but it could happen.
Wow. We have a question about the transportation. What quantities of liquor could be moved by wholesalers in the state? I think the question is, could you drive a big truckload?
Yes, that could happen. And there are reports of trucks loads getting hijacked. Yes, I think it depends on, I guess, the size of the wholesale operation. But yeah, they use trucks. Frequently, that was cars. I interviewed someone a few years ago whose father was a bootlegger. And he recalled that his father had a large Cadillac, and he had taken the back seat out, and he had special tires and suspension put in it. And he said like 20 to 40 cases could be loaded in that Cadillac. So, and of course, some of the records we got from Louisiana, you had to indicate the route you were taking. And of course, usually it was like Highway 80 or Highway 61 or something like that. But they tried to track that down. Typically, the bootleggers, though, would try to find a back road and go out of their way if necessary. So, did that answer the question?
I think so. Another question from you. Were there any African-American liquor wholesalers in Mississippi during this era?
I think there were. And I think, I'm not sure where it was now, but I think I've seen that. It might be hard to tell unless you just knew from the records. But I'm thinking there was at least one or two. The wholesalers, well, they varied at times, but I think about the end, around the end before Prohibition ended, there were probably only about a dozen or 15 wholesalers in the state. There were lots of African American retailers, though. I can answer that.
Was beer taxed along with liquor in the same way? Was it covered?
Not exactly. And I'm not real clear about our history with beer, but beer was available on a local option basis, I recall, after, I think around 1940, maybe earlier. It had a separate tax from the liquor tax and was handled entirely differently. And as I understand too, since it was not prohibited by law, the tax commission handled the sales tax on beer rather than the tax collector.
Was Bailey challenged in court over the flexibility she used in per case taxes versus the 10% on total sales?
I don't think so. I don't recall reading where that was ever challenged. And it's interesting to me too. Like I said, I'm not a legal scholar, and I haven't perhaps done all the homework on this, but I could not find anywhere where the black market tax law itself was challenged. And I'm assuming it wasn't because it was still in effect when it was abolished. It seems like more often than not, when the tax collector wanted to go after someone, they used the 1910 law, which essentially said you can't sell liquor, and if you do, you're going to be fined $500. And that's how they, at least in some examples, used that as leverage against the bootlegger to force them to pay the black market tax. So,
one last question. Do you know how the current ABC system compares revenue-wise with the black market tax system?
I do not. I suspect now, though, that we're taking in a lot more money than we did in 1964.
Tom, this was fabulous, as always.
Thank you.
Enjoy having you and look forward to more. I want to remind everyone about tomorrow's Sounds of Prohibition program that will be live streamed on the Museum of Mississippi History Facebook page. And of course, Mississippi Distilled, which is on the second floor here of the museums through the end of the year. Finally, tune in next week for Larry Wells and his discussion of life in the Faulkner clan. But for today, thank you all for watching. Tom Henderson, thank you for this program.